Welcome to a new episode of the Turkish VC podcast, where we talk about the Turkish startup and VC ecosystem. I am very excited today. We have Enis Hulli, who is a GP at e2vc, formerly known as 500 EE or Emerging Europe. Before that, yeah. 500 Istanbul before that.
We change names every 3 years.
Every fund, because they're on raising fund 3 now. So it's an exciting time for them. So it's a great time to be talking with him. And Enis had his own podcast, so actually more experience in the podcast area than me, perhaps. So it should be a fun episode. So let's dive right into it. Enis, I thought it would be great to start with just your background. How did you get into VC? Start with that.
I went to school in Montreal, Canada. I went to McGill. I was super bored. It was negative 20 degrees. There's nothing to do. What am I doing with my life? And my wife now, girlfriend back then, used to live in London. So I was going to London really frequently. I mean, we would see each other every few weeks. Basically, she would come, I would go. And that's how I learned about the startup ecosystem. It wasn't a thing in Montreal, but then my friends who were studying in the US, in fact, one of them is now one of our portfolio founders, were into the startup world. And they told me how there's this thing called startups. This was 2010, 2011. And going back and forth to London, I met with my co-founder. We started a small marketing tech company with some small pre-seed funding, which didn't do that well. I was still in college back then. I left.
Co-founder for that startup, or also co-founder at?
No, just that startup. Met him at a startup event in London. He already had the pre-seed funding secured. So I joined him, tried for a year, didn't work out, left, finished college, came to Istanbul. Back then, Rocket Internet had its ventures here in Istanbul. And then my good friend Akın, now we co-invested a lot in gaming. He's the founder of Triple Dot Studios, got me a position at Rocket Internet. I was there for a bit, but then obviously Rocket decided to leave Turkey as well. That's how I went into the heating, ventilation, air conditioning industry, because our family has air conditioning operations in bit southern near Izmir, and I did civil engineering, unfortunately, so I knew the mechanical engineering work a little bit. I did that for a bit, then decided to do my own angel network called First Seed, which is how I met with 500 startups. That was the name back in the day, 2015. We hit off really well, so they told me that I can do a franchise fund, a micro fund, focused solely on Turkey. So 2016, I was trying to raise fund 1.
So angel investing period. I mean, how was that experience? Any of those bets pay off?
It did not, but I think boredom is good. So I was bored 2010, decided to do a startup, and then learned about this whole world. And I was bored again doing heating, ventilation, air conditioning, had some savings. And my good friend, who's actually one of our investors now, was running a startup. He was the first one to convince me to, pull together, even if it's a little bit of capital, even if it's a couple $100K that I'll get from friends and family, just pull that together, turn that into an angel network, launch a website, and then try to do small deals of 5 to 10K per person, deal size 50 to 100K, but start from somewhere. And back then there was Startup Bootcamp in Istanbul, 2014-15. I was going there really frequently. So after work, after 6 p.m., for example, when the construction site kind of winds down, rather than going back home, I would go to Startup Bootcamp to just meet with entrepreneurs there. And one of the companies, Zeppelin, in fact, did super well, which was also really inspiring for me to see. I guess that was the nudge for me to at least start exploring.
So you did have at least one that worked out well.
No, it wasn't.
Oh, you didn't invest in it.
I just knew them well.
So what built the momentum there was seeing at least some of them that succeeded, and then also just more that you enjoyed it rather than
I enjoyed
financial success.
It didn't feel like work. Basically, it still doesn't feel like work. I think the part of a VC meeting with founders who are almost always smarter than you, more ambitious than you, doesn't feel like work. Back then, I thought that was what I was going to do for life, 100% of my time. Not the case as a venture capitalist. That's probably 30 to 50% of your job description, but still, that part definitely doesn't feel like work.
And then after that, would you call it a franchise fund, micro fund?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to call it a franchise fund, but it did resemble a franchise fund. So basically, 500 enables. I was 25 years old back then. And as a 25-year-old person who's never raised a fund, first I convinced Rina to jump on board. She's now the founder of Spike Games. But then having a US brand gives this false sense of confidence to investors. I'm saying it's a false sense of confidence because eventually it's you who's running the fund, doing the investments, etc. But then having that brand behind you who's also helping with all these backups. So everything that's around, fund financials, legal, accounting, deal making, none of which important. I knew were important. So we did a carry split, a management fee split, and then that's how we rolled up 500 Startups Istanbul Fund 1.
So that helped then with the brand a little bit. But you still have to do all the fundraising yourself.
Yeah, you fundraise yourself. You're basically like an emerging manager trying to fundraise yourself, build a brand. Obviously, you leverage their brand, but you have to build a local brand as well, and then do your own deals.
So your angel investments there, although you didn't have a great successes to point to,
No.
but at least you had some experience to point to and
I
knowing
think I had
that.
experienced deal sourcing. I think my deal sourcing experience was there. So a lot of the common practices now are on data-driven sourcing. I was already doing that as a hobby back in 2014, 15, just out of curiosity. But that's it. That's where my experience ended. I didn't have any good investing experience or knowing all the intricacies of deal making or portfolio management.
But you pointed to that kind of sourcing experience or fundraising, because that's definitely right. Having at least some sort of a track record, and mostly you were raising outside of the Turkey, or
so initial investors. I think we had 18 investors in Fund One, all Turkish. Some corporates, some high net worth individuals, but I think the first believers of a fund manager are mostly not institutions, but rather your close first or second circle. Moving on to Fund Two, that did diversify a little bit. We had a Hungarian fund of funds, EBRD, IFC to jump on board. We have a German fund of funds also, but again, it's majority Turkish Fund Two.
So then Fund Two, and now you're raising Fund Three. Is Fund One still kind of living its cycle?
It is living its cycle. It's currently at year 8. I think it saw its all-time high and its peak in 2021, 2022, given zero interest rate environment. Every single company can, raise a lot of funding. Back then, we were almost close to being at 6x, but obviously that came down a little bit. We had 8 exits so far in the fund. There are 28 active positions, 3 of which are unicorns, Insider, Carbon Health, and Billion to One. We have another 3 companies that are 100 million.
So Fund One was pretty successful.
Fund One, a smaller fund is obviously easier to return, but yes, it was successful, both from an IRR, TVPI, and DPI perspective.
So even though there's still, as we say, from a DVPI perspective, so even though you still have 28 continuing, you've already dispersed?
Some, yes. I think our thesis initially was, so as a fund, you call capital in the first 5 years. And then our goal was to give 1x back on year 7. So the effective money holding period would be 4 to 5 years. Failed on that number's 7-figure because it was 2023 and IPO market wasn't opening up. M&As wasn't as active. That got pushed back to year 8. But still, I think it's on par. And the goal is, at least for our fund, to give back 1x on year 8, be more like a 3x DPI on year 10, so that you can get those 2-year extensions. There's always we have 2 plus 1 year extensions we can get. We want to get those to see the potential of all of the assets in the fund. And I think 3 unicorns, $300 million plus companies, and then probably another 4 or 5 companies that can get there. So we still have like active 10, 11 positions where we're seeing some upside, potential upside.
And the ecosystem here is so new that this will be really among the first cohort of funds that will finish their cycle. I don't know if there are really any funds yet that have really run a full cycle Turkish.
If full cycle means closing the fund, I don't think so. But if full cycle means giving good returns, it did happen. So if you look at 2012, 2013, there were 3 active funds, one of which did tremendously well, I guess gave somewhere between 13 to 15x back to the LPs. Another one is currently at, obviously, we don't want to point them out, but this other fund is probably at more than 5x money multiple, already gave probably around 2x DPI. And then there's this other fund who's also, given a bit more than 1x. So I think
funds that have turned around already, but just in terms of timing wise, it's, of a 10-year life cycle, or still seeing that the first wave will be the first cohort of funds getting their course still.
And I think that's the single most determinant parameter for a success of a venture fund is where you've invested in. It's like rising tide lifts all boats. So if the fund has started at the right time, then even if you're a
vintage,
the right vintage, even if you're a median fund, you did well. And then the opposite also exists. If you started at an okay timing, a median fund would be returning, I would say, negative. Would be less than 1x. If you've started in a really bad timing, then even if you're a top decile fund, returns would be, I think, comparable to the S&P.
So how do you feel about the vintage you're starting now with Fund 3? A good time?
I always think it's a good time, but I have no idea, to be honest with you. We started Fund 2 in 2021. It was a 70 million fund, and arguably that's the worst time ever because
the first fund was
2016.
And how much?
10 million.
And so 10 to 70.
10 to 70 in 2021. Looking at that time, it didn't seem like it's the worst time to start because all the companies were getting great valuations and there's a big hype towards entrepreneurship, IPOs, etc. But now looking back, it's probably the worst time to start a fund because it was like the peak of the peak of the peak. It's a time frame. I don't think we're ever going to live through that time frame again in our lives. But luckily, I don't think it was a strategy, but I think luckily out of a 70 million fund 2, we've only deployed 4 million in 2021. and probably 8 million in 2022. So our total exposure into that peak of the market has been 12 million out of the 70, again, by luck. Just because we were slow to invest, we're also growing the team at the same time, etc. It wasn't because we had this macro perspective that, we have to start slow. It was more we got lucky.
So if I can probe a bit, so what's I think it's great you're launching Fund 3, but what's the rationale behind that? Because it sounds like you still have some dry powder left with Fund 2.
We do. I mean, our goal is to do about 45% first tickets, 60% follow-ons. From the current fund, so far, we've deployed probably around 40 million. That 40 million is split about 50-50, I would say, first ticket follow-on. But we're seeing good success. So I think our first, we do pre-seed, right? So our investments are purely pre-seed. Sometimes it's only a 2 to 3 people team with nothing. Sometimes it's with some prototype, but none of the companies we've invested had even 250K annual revenue, for example. The number was 0. So it's that risky. It's either pre-seed or some seed. And so it's
not really pre-revenue, but almost pre-revenue.
Almost pre-revenue. Like I would say 30% of them are almost pre-revenue, 70% of them are pre-revenue. So the way we see the graduation in our portfolio is twofold. It's two pairs. There's the fundraising graduation, there's the revenue graduation. From a fundraising graduation perspective, our first bar is whether companies can get $5 million in total raise. And then the second bar is whether they can get 15 million plus total raise. So currently out of our 36 investment, 15 of them got to that 5 million plus, and then 4 of them got to 15 million plus. Feel confident that out of that 36, probably 24 of them are going to get to that 5 million plus, and 10 of them are going to get to that 15 million plus. That's more fundraising. In terms of revenue, there are currently 18 companies that do more than 250K annualized revenue. Again, that number was 0 when we invested initially into all of these companies. There's another 6 companies doing 2 million plus and 2 companies doing 10 million plus. So that's the graduation we're seeing on the revenue perspective. Our perspective is that the current dry powder we have is going to be reserved for follow-ons for the success of these companies, which is going to hopefully get us to like 35-40% first tickets, 60% plus in follow-on funding for Fund 2. And then that pushed us to raise Fund 3. Lastly, we're a pre-seed fund, right? You don't want to do a pre-seed investment on year 4 or year 5. Doesn't make sense. As a 10-year fund, if you're doing pre-seed deals on year 5, you haven't given enough time for the entrepreneur to iterate, find product market fit, raise funding, and grow. Hence, you have to raise.
And so, kind of reverse pitch. What's your value add, or how you present yourself to founders?
I mean, our thesis from the start has been that we're bridging founders to the US, and it's a two-way street. It's either bridging founders who are already in the US with the technology talent back in emerging Europe, or investing in founders who are already based in emerging Europe and then bridging them to the US. Bridging to the US, I think that bridge from US to Turkey is or emerging Europe is pretty obvious. It's talent. We're enabling them to open their tech operations in emerging Europe. The other way is more around revenue financing, M&A, IPO. Most of the times, the founder also moves to the Bay Area. If you look at our Fund 1, out of the $600 million annual revenue that the portfolio generates, it's 95%. Not 95, but like 92% US. If you look at Fund 2, currently the portfolio generates about 120 million. Annual revenue is probably 70% US, 30% not. So we try to position ourselves as the most American fund in the region. To do that, we launched an SF office. Our principal lives in SF. Our COO lives in New York, and then I'm the one who's traveling back and forth to London. How that turns into an actual value add to the portfolio is, I think, first and foremost, follow-on funding. We've been really prolific in enabling our portfolio to raise follow-on funding. Our Fund 1 companies raised about 3 billion to date. Our Fund 2 companies raised about 250 million to date. I think that's 90% of the value that we provide. The other 10% would be talent. We have a 2-people talent team where we place, source, help them with culture, org design, etc. And we want to deepen that with Fund 3.
So those presences in New York and San Francisco support the companies, but also for fundraising, right? Because then you have connections with VCs locally.
Yes, I think it creates a soft landing pad for entrepreneurs, especially for a founder who's moving from Istanbul, say, to the Bay Area,
right.
Being part of a community, knowing someone who's going to do these, like, we call that connecting the dots, but like introductions to people that, either you have synergies with, can be customers, can be partners, can be co-investors that would want to jump around, value-added angels, experts, is step 1. And then step 2, which is probably 12 months after our first investment, is fundraising support. There we go even more hands-on, narrative, pitch deck, support building, and then doing introductions to 50 to 100 VCs who we think are relevant either from a geo perspective or from a industry perspective.
Is your kind of positioning to LPs similar, or is there a kind of a different part of the story?
Our positioning to the LP is, I think, venture capital is a very US game. if you curb that power law, venture capital stops making sense. If there aren't going to be any decacorns, which is the case in a lot of parts in Europe, for example, Germany doesn't have a decacorn, then venture capital as an asset class fails miserably. I mean, we think it's a really US focused game where all of our companies' revenue generations from the US, they build their sales and marketing in the US, they fundraise from the US. If they exit or if they IPO, that's also going to be in the US. And emerging Europe is the only emerging market you can execute that thesis. You cannot execute that thesis in Southeast Asia. All of the Southeast Asian success stories are regional companies. All the MENA unicorns are MENA unicorns. Even in a place like France, if you look at every single Series B company in France, 80% of their revenue will be from France. Not the case in the geography that we're targeting. And this makes this geography unique where you cannot execute this thesis anywhere else.
And it's exciting because the US is a big market.
It's not a big market. It's bigger than the rest of the world combined, kind of a big market, you know?
Big market is an understatement.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of the market, right? When you're talking about technology.
Especially for enterprise sales too. I mean, we do a lot of B2B. 80% of our portfolio is B2B. In enterprise sales, I'd say 60% of the world's enterprise budget in the US.
On a different track, I'm just curious, there's the whole concept of impact funds and impact investing. And I kind of find that, for some people, any venture capital is already creating impact because it's a unique asset class in that sense that you're investing in companies that are solving big problems. You're creating a 0 to 1, Silicon Valley idea of, changing the world. I mean, how do you feel about that? Is that anywhere in part of your motivation or what are your thoughts on?
I agree 100%. I think any venture capital, any company building, venture building is impact. It creates a lot of value for everyone involved and, for the surrounding area. The way we look at it is, whenever we invest in a company, these are all sub 10 people companies. So for us, they start as impact starter, where we only track simple metrics like diversity and inclusion, HR policies. The moment there are more than 10 people, then we want those to be in place. And then there are some companies that are aligned with UN SDGs. Maybe they're working around waste, maybe they're working on carbon, maybe they're working around education, for example. So we try to map those with specific UN SDGs. And then together with the founder, we look for 3 to 5 metrics, non-financial, non-business metrics, more impact-related metrics that we're going to track quarter over quarter. And then any of our companies that goes 100 people is ESG highlight. So irrelevant of whether your mission aligns with a UN SDG or not, if you're more than 100 people, you have to. So our ESG highlight companies are either the ones that where their core mission aligns with an UN SDG, or it doesn't, but yet they were more than 100 people as a team. So they are very impactful in their society. That resonates with me. Whether that motivates me, unfortunately, I don't think so. I think I look more on a granular basis. Backing a founder and making her to live up to her potential motivates me a lot. But then that impact that one company can create in the society doesn't motivate me as much. The fact that the multiplier effect exists so that more entrepreneurs are going to spur out of this also motivates me. I really think that, courage is contagious. So when someone walks away, a lot of people follow him or her. And with gaming that happened in Turkey after peak, there were 80 studios that came out of peak. I think now it's happening on B2B SaaS thanks to Insider. That does motivate me.
Yeah. I mean, that was kind of my point is that's kind of an impact in and of itself, right? I mean, we were just talking earlier about how we don't even have really the first cohort of funds that have run their first cycle. I mean, it's such a new ecosystem that any investments in this in Turkey and in the region are making a big impact.
And I think what's more important than it being new is it went through a transformation. I can argue that if you compare, for example, Estonia to Turkey, people would say that Estonia is a mature ecosystem because it saw generations of successes. So did Turkey. I mean, go 2010, Turkey was one of the leading ecosystems in Europe, in EMEA in general. But then it kind of stagnated for 10 years. Then it picked up again. What happened, why that 10-year cycle happened is because it went through a transformation where these local success stories gave leeway to more global success stories. It isn't to say that this happens in every ecosystem. It doesn't. If you look at Southeast Asia, MENA, India, no, it didn't give leeway to global success stories. They're still riding those local success stories. It's just different categories. Or if you look at Estonia, for example, they were having global success stories from the start, so they didn't have to go through a transformation. Turkey has been this unique case where it did go through a transformation.
That leads me to another question, which is, so you're not just Turkey focused, you're focused on what you call emerging Europe. How do you see kind of the different parts of the region? Maybe if you want to define what that region is, and then how do you see Turkey versus the other countries in that region?
So we define our emerging Europe region as the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and then all the way to Turkey, including Ukraine. The way we look at every ecosystem is unique. Obviously, it's siloed. It's 20 different countries, if not more, 20 cultures, 20 languages. What's unique is there's no regional success story. So there's no unicorn that started in Turkey, expanded to Bulgaria, Romania, became a unicorn. It's not feasible. It doesn't exist. It's not attractive to the founder either. If the founder is going to try to internationalize from
maybe Blue Ground, maybe, of course, afterwards they went global.
They did UK. And I think, so every single ecosystem has its own characteristic. Poland, Romania, Turkey are the larger countries, out of which we see the most local businesses still come out of Poland. I think they had a lot of local success stories in 2018, 2020 vintage, which gave courage for entrepreneurs to follow that path. And they tried this Poland and European expansion, which is not something we invest in a lot. We only have probably 2 or 3 portfolio companies that do that. That's not our core thesis. But in Poland, we see that dynamic where look at top 1% of entrepreneurs, probably half of them are still pursuing a bit more local or regional dreams, not fully global. Turkey has been through that transformation. So I think the top 1% of entrepreneurs, almost 100% of those are having global dreams. No one has a local dream. Romania is similar to Turkey because it's smaller than Poland. And then it didn't have a lot of local success stories either. Apart from these 3 countries, across the region, given that these are like, from an ecosystem and population perspective, small countries, no one has local or regional dreams, I would say. It's either inherently global, like a lot of the gaming companies are. It doesn't have to be US focused or purely US focused.
Okay. I mean, how do you think about that? I mean, does it just, from your perspective make sense because the returns are there and that's what your thesis is? Or, I mean, do you think there's kind of like a different, if we're talking about, companies that solve problems, it makes sense there's a class of problems that need to be solved locally that may not be global businesses, but
There are a lot of businesses where entrepreneurs would make money, but a venture capital fund, especially like ours, wouldn't. Our thesis is that half of our companies are going to fail, and there's 30% of them, are going to give 1x back. So there's that 20% where it really matters. It really matters what the top 1, 2, or 3 holdings do. If they end up doing, it's not that good. If they end up doing 50x from our initial investment, then we're going to have a good fund. So when you plot your financial model like that, which you don't have to, but we did, then you want to shoot for the stars. You want every single one of your opportunities to be a shot on goal. And then you cannot do that. Although you're solving a real problem for that local or regional country or region, it wouldn't give you that upside potential. Doesn't mean our fund thesis is the only fund thesis that can exist. There are other funds where their fail rate will be much lower, but then the upsides will be more capped.
That would be the trade-off there. Makes sense. And then, so just double clicking again on this before we move on. So each ecosystem is different. Turkey, we talked about right now that it's gotten more of a global focus. Any other aspects of Turkey? I mean, the talent or other dynamics of funding or lack of funding. I mean, how does it differentiate itself from other players in the region, other countries in the region?
I think funding-wise, if you're doing gaming in Turkey, it's very liquid. A lot of the top gaming funds or top generalist funds with some gaming focus do look into Turkey, but gaming is an exception. If you look at every single other industry, B2B, SaaS, dev tools, AI, which is what we do mostly, 70% of our portfolio is either AI, ML, or dev tools. It's not the case. It's not like generalist investors are looking all the time into Turkey to do these seed plus or Series A investments, which creates this uphill battle for an entrepreneur who's based in Turkey to raise that funding, which isn't the case in the rest of emerging Europe. A lot of the EU countries, I think a lot of the funds have an EU-specific mandate. They want to invest into EU27. So they do cover Croatia or Hungary. They don't cover Turkey. But then again, because 70% of our portfolio founders relocate to the Bay Area, that becomes less of a problem for us. But it does become a problem for probably 10 to 20% of our portfolio, which are non-gaming, non-Bay Area native companies who are still based in Turkey.
Does it give you an edge in terms of, less competition on the term sheet, better valuation?
100% it did. I'm not sure if it's going to continue moving forward because there are new funds coming up. A lot of the existing funds are also doing more and more pre-seed investments. Every single fund wants to do gaming investments as well. I mean, it was already tough to do gaming investments as a local fund. If you look at top gaming success stories out of the country, there's almost no local VC that has backed any of these companies because of a lot of reasons. It's the pre-seeds of these gaming company investments are relatively large. There are a lot of top gaming funds that are looking into Turkey, which then pushes you to a position where you can only be a follower. And now there's probably 5 local funds who are trying to become that follower. So long story short, past 3-4 years, I think it was less competitive for us. Gaming, non-gaming doesn't matter. But now that everyone wants to do pre-seed, everyone wants to do Bay Area native investments, everyone wants to do gaming, it's becoming more competitive.
So is that kind of, in a sense, though, a good problem to have in the sense that, I mean, it's, yes, competition is competition, but it's an industry that compared to other industries I've seen, there's a little bit more of more players grow the whole pie kind of thing.
I'm not sure whether more players are going to grow the whole pie. Skeptic on that, but it pushes us to be better, and that's good. I think it pushes us to take more risks, do more team building, launch the SF office. In fact, maybe hire 2 more people in SF for that to become a full-fledged 3-people office. Maybe if there was no competition, we wouldn't have done any of that, and now we are. So it's better. It's more fun also. It's more entrepreneurial. Otherwise, venture capital fund is boring. I mean, I'm only 33 years old. If I'm gonna continue being a venture capitalist for say 30 more years, like I don't know, fund 10, that was a super boring life. Now it's more exciting.
Yeah, and it's fun to see it evolve, right? You don't want it to be always the same. It's fun to see, and it's fun to see it evolve for the better, obviously, rather than going south. So, and it's definitely a growing ecosystem. So, you mentioned different sectors: gaming, AI, B2B SaaS. What's a sector right now that you find that you really believe in that you think nobody else is really paying enough attention to?
First of all, I'm not that big on that idea. I think if you go back 4 years and you believe AI is going to come up, the worst thing you would do is to invest in pre-seed AI companies in Turkey. That's the worst way you can try to leverage your thinking. You can buy NVIDIA stock and you'll be well off by now. You'll be done. Life. So we're much more founder-driven. Founders put us into those buckets. That's why Fund 1, we did a lot in biotech and health tech. In fact, out of our 3 unicorns, 2 of them were biotech. 1 of them was biotech, 1 of them was health tech. And then out of the other top 5 positions we have, 3 of them are health tech. Doesn't mean to say that we had a big thesis on health tech or we understood a lot. We didn't. We just followed great entrepreneurs. They ended up doing health or bio on that, vintage. On 2, we didn't think we would do a lot this much in AI. We knew we were going to do dev tools because end of Fund 1, we started to do some dev tools, which we doubled down with Fund 2. But then AI happened for us over the past 2 years. I was trying to look at this. So our first 20 investments, only 5 were AI, which isn't that small, but it's not that big either. The other 15 investments we did, 11 of them are AI. If you hone in on Gen AI, in the first 20 investments, we did 5 AI, out of which only 2 were Gen AI. 3 wasn't Gen AI. It was ML Ops, General AI, etc. But from the last 15 investments, where 11 were AI, 10 of them were Gen AI. So that also shows you how, a lot of the founders probably moved to that direction. We just followed them. We end up being in that bucket. I think this AI wave is going to continue. The AI adoption on AI from a consumer perspective comes in waves. 3 years ago with GPT-2, it was social media, blogging. There were companies like Jasper AI, which went from nothing to more than 100 million annual revenue. This was like 2021, 2022. I think last year was more around image. Like our portfolio company went from 0 to 40 million ARR in a year. Past 6 months, it's been more developer, copilot, dev tools, and AI, the intersection of the two. Beginning of last year, if you're talking about Gen AI and how that's going to impact coding, was much more philosophical. There were good videos, but the actual applications weren't there. The accuracies weren't good. But now, past 6 months, that industry has seen an inflection where Lovable, Cursor, Bolt, our portfolio company, Pythagora, are all seeing their, adoption wave come into that industry. So I think those waves are going to continue in different industries. And our goal is to obviously take bets around Gen AI for either more vertical applications that are industry specific or more horizontal, but closer to the infra level.
That's super interesting. I mean, that the two are actually connected, but you're going after good teams as the top criteria, but actually good teams tend to gravitate to certain sectors. And we were talking earlier, similarly, there's the impact of, is it a good sector? Then there's also the impact of aspirational or seeing an example with exits in the gaming sector, then leading to other gaming startups. And similarly, Insider, I'm seeing some activity around cybersecurity in Turkey, at least as well. So there are no big exits yet, perhaps, but some investments, big investments from VCs outside of Turkey, and that kind of, especially if we see an exit, I see that as a sector where local talent can potentially be gravitating towards as another kind of.
We did do a couple of cybersecurity investments. Out of the 2 funds in total, we did 5 investments, so less than 10% of the portfolio, like more like 7-8% of the portfolio. I think cybersecurity for Turkey has been a very local play. There are a lot of companies doing a lot of good revenue, but locally. And then that obviously has its own glass ceiling. But then cybersecurity in general becomes a distribution game really fast. You have that opportunity window that's there for, say, 2 years. And if you can land those large contracts in the US, you leverage that 2-year window and then you become a big company. But if you fail to leverage that 2-year window, then competition comes up really fast, and then it becomes a very distribution game that puts another stagnation or ceiling on top of the opportunity. So there are a lot of cybersecurity companies in Turkey that are doing, 10 to 30 million, I would say, in annual revenue. Seems to be a lot. But then when cybersecurity becomes too competitive, the multiples also tend to come down. And then these companies, which might potentially be worth much larger in other industries, start being worth close to 100 million, which is obviously great, but then not amazing.
Not giving you the returns. And that's really, I mean, for cybersecurity or other companies, that's the big leap, right? Is getting into the US market.
It's a distribution game, and I don't think it's an advantage for the talent base here. It's a disadvantage.
Right.
In DevTools, what we believed is a lot of the DevTools products are zero-touch sales or bottoms-up motion, which make sales really critical, but not as top-down and pushy, not with all that friction that happens around that sales cycle, which kind of curbs that disadvantage that the region has. And then that's why we did, out of the 36 companies, probably 12, 13 of them are DevTools, excluding the ones that are on Gen AI DevTools.
Probably also why mobile gaming is a good, you don't have to go through a sales cycle. It's just on the app store or whatever.
Exactly. And consumerization of SaaS as well, like that, B2B SaaS starting to resemble B2C sales is also a good momentum.
So, I mean, how do you feel about that? Is that, there's the idea in football or soccer that if you have somebody whose left foot is good, don't make them train on their right foot, them in the left forward position. I mean, do you think Turkish startups should double down on, we're not great at building a B2B sales organization in the US. Let's double down on just trying to do more prosumer type of sales? Or do you think it's a skill that the Turkish ecosystem should really try to grow know-how in?
The ecosystem should grow the know-how for sure, but more on a granular company specific perspective. I think initially, if you're 12 out of 10 at something, just do that, because that would get you from 0 to 1. But then as you scale, you have to start becoming more well-rounded and, push all the buttons, because it does in any industry, it becomes more competitive as you scale, because other companies are scaling as well. So I think it really depends where you are as a founder, as a company.
I suppose Insider may be a good sort of example for that. I mean, they must have been, it's a pretty sales intensive process and they have offices around the world.
It's a really interesting story, because like one company being the top 3 player in 20 countries around the world brings its own defensibility. Historically, if you look at SaaS success stories, a lot of them would be first US focused until becoming a unicorn, and then they would launch operations in, say, Europe, for example, etc. So it's a US to global approach. Or some of them, like UiPath, would be wherever you are, but then the marketing you're tackling is the US, which is also majority of our portfolio. But then there are ones like Insider or Pipedrive where you don't have to go to the US from day one. In fact, it's so competitive that, it wouldn't make sense, but you can target 20 other countries similar to Turkey, dominate those markets or become one of the top 3 players. And that brings its own defensible moat where, can you compete with Insider in one country? Sure, you can. Can you compete with Insider in 20 countries? Good luck with that. And then once you're strong enough, both from a product, resource, you target the US.
So, I mean, how replicable is that? I mean, or is that like, Insider did it, but good luck to anyone else trying to use that strategy?
I think it's replicable. I think Pipedrive also did it, for example, with more of a zero-touch sales approach, more bottoms-up, self-serve platform, etc. So I think that not just in Turkey, but globally, it's another way to create a B2B SaaS unicorn.
There's a trap there, which is what you were talking about earlier about falling into kind of a local or regional play. It's a different strategy, right? It's trying to go into so many different markets that you become global and not saying, I'm going to 3-4 markets and I'm just going to stay there.
I think that was already there. So I think B2B SaaS unicorns, it was either US to the rest of the world, or you start somewhere but you target the US, or you're solving a hyper-local problem, might be accounting, might be HR. So it's so hyper-local that you can become a regional unicorn, like Smart HR out of Japan or out of Southeast Asia would be a good example. So those existed, but those are capped with the region. Insider or Pipedrive is a different story where it's not hyper-local. The problem is not hyper-local. It's much more scalable than that. And if you try to make it hyper-local, it wouldn't be as venturable, because if you're trying to do Insider of Eastern Europe, it's not that big of a market. And that fourth street, that fourth lane, has opened up over the past 5-6 years, not just for Turkey or for Insider, but globally. We're seeing more and more companies replicate that.
What's biggest miss company that you didn't invest in?
Oh, there's so many of them, especially in Eastern Europe. When we started to do Eastern Europe 2018, we had probably like $2.5 million dry powder left from Fund 1. And we were doing deals in Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, so more like Southeast Europe. We didn't do Poland or Baltics, for example, just because we didn't feel proximities there. And then we looked at every single good opportunity there is in Eastern Europe, and we missed almost on all of them, I would say. just because we felt like why are we the ones to do this deal was the biggest hindrance on our minds. Why? I mean, there are a lot of funds looking into Romania. Why should we be doing it? And then we didn't, but then the company ended up doing well. There's probably a list of 10 companies like that from Central Europe, like Shion from Hungary would be a good example. Bitrise from Hungary would be another good example. FintechOS from Romania, Payhawk from Bulgaria. These are all good examples of like our big misses in Eastern Europe. So a lot in Eastern Europe. In Turkey, especially out of the ones that fit our mandate, we did meet with Dream Games, for example. 2019, we did meet with a bunch of times. But to be fair, it's not like we passed. It's more like there was no allocation. So yeah, there's a lot of them. I mean, if we've backed 3 unicorns, we probably missed 13 unicorns.
Flip side question. Shout out you'd want to make to an best LP or best founder?
Interesting question. Yeah, I'll do a shout out to Akın from X Triple Dot, now doing his own fund. So I met Akın really weirdly. So I met him 2009. I was in Boston. I didn't have a place to stay. So I messaged my college group, like, does anyone know you in Boston? I stay at the place. And then I stayed at Akın's place. So he first gave me my first internship at Maçkolik. Then he got me to Rocket Internet. Then while raising Fund 1, he was the one to introduce me with Rina. And then while we weren't doing much in gaming, he was the one to enable us to do more in gaming and open the doors where we did Cypher, Agave, Frantic, Pine, all these great gaming studios together with him. So yeah, be him.
And is that fund sort of focused on this region as well, or is it US based?
It's global mobile gaming. Yeah,
mobile gaming, which there's a lot of mobile gaming in Turkey too. So
exactly, I think Turkey is one of the top 3 hubs. And when you compare Finland, I think is funny because I think it's not doing that well in gaming these days. I was speaking to someone from Moonfire, and he said something like Playtika laid off 400 people from Finland. None of them became whereas they laid off 50 people in Israel, and there was 10 studios came out of it. In Turkey, that number would have been, orders of magnitude more. I just said Moonfire. I was going to say Moonactive, by the way. Moonfire is a VC fund we compete with a lot.
What thoughts would you share for somebody who's raising the first fund now in the region?
I think people tend to try to do a larger fund, and they think that it's not worth it if they're going to do a smaller fund, but then that increases the bar and lowers the probability. I don't think that makes sense at all. So even if you can raise 3 million, 5 million, just do it. And then a lot of the emerging managers would try to start off like 40, 50 million funds to be able to go to DFIs, which I understand they want to go to local DFIs like the Turkish Development Bank, Turkish Wealth Fund, or EBRD, IFC, EIF. And that requires a certain size. But then bear in mind that you are lowering your probability.
So stay realistic and start moving.
Yeah.
Start to be able to deploy. And how about to yourself, 10 years ago when you were starting out, what would you have done differently? What advice would you give yourself?
Bay Area. So back then I was going to the Bay Area probably once every 6 months. I was in the Bay Area, and we did do a lot of good investments there. Carbon Health was Bay Area, $8 billion to 1, which is another one of our unicorns. In fact, that was me cold messaging Osan LinkedIn. It was a LinkedIn investment for us. Became a unicorn. And then a lot of the people around me in the Bay Area were telling me that I should spend more time in the Bay Area, which I didn't. There were a lot of moving pieces. We were a 2-people team. We were doing deals left and right. We were fundraising at the same time. The moment we stopped fundraising for Fund 1, we started ideating for Fund 2. So there wasn't enough time. But looking back, I should have done that, because it's not like I'm going to have more free time. I didn't have more free time moving forward. Later on, raising Fund 2, building the team, etc. Han and Aaron are both, my partner and my co-GP, are going to Bay Area a lot. They spend a month every 6 months in the Bay Area. Our principal is based there, but I wish I did have the opportunity to spend more time.
That would have given you more exposure to the bridge in the other direction, as you described, of maybe diaspora founders who are there and then may want to have a connection with an engineering team back here.
Exactly. And to be honest with you, I think there are probably 15 Turkish entrepreneurs in the US that we want to back every year. And out of that 15, we're probably getting 5. We're losing 10. Out of the 10 that we lose, 5 of them we're not even hearing about. And now 5 we're competing and we're losing. We're not even hearing about them because it's nowhere. It's not on their LinkedIn. A lot of top founders would raise, large pre-seed, sometimes seed rounds, and then refresh their LinkedIns. So there's an opportunity for us to triple.
Be better connected, their network.
Yeah.
And how does it, company culture wise, et cetera, firm culture wise, to have offices in New York, San Francisco, Istanbul? And travel, it's a 12-hour flight. Is that, manageable? Is it a non-issue, or is it something that you think about?
So people criticize us that our culture is very sales-oriented, which it is. So 10-people team, everyone does deal sourcing. Even if you're a talent person, 50% of your time is deal sourcing. If you're the CFO, you're doing financials, audit, accounting, etc. for the fund, 50% of your time is deal sourcing. What we thought is that if you strip away deal sourcing, that's the core purpose of existence of this fund. If you strip that away from someone's job description, then they're not a venture capitalist anymore, which pushed us to be more siloed. So every single person is covering a different country. An analyst covers Bulgaria, another associate covers Greece for us, for example, but they're solo operators. So they would go to that market once every quarter, spend time, meet, build those connections. Their whole data-driven sourcing system would be focused either on that country or the country's diaspora or immigrants in the UK or the US, etc. So going remote or having people in SF and New York didn't bother us as much, just because everyone was all the time everywhere anyways.
So it's everybody's pretty atomic or
it has
enabled.
its pros and cons, but though that remote nature didn't hurt us after Esat moved to New York and Tunya moved.
Any questions that you would have wished I had asked you that I didn't?
No, I'm good. I think Fund 3 we're raising now, obviously. We're probably going to close it by summer. $100 million fund, same thesis, Baltics, Eastern Europe, Turkey, pre-seed, bridging to the US.
I mean, so how do you see e2vc 5 years from now or 10 years from now?
We have to diversify our product. One thing, we have to launch different vehicles, whether that's venture debt, secondaries, pre-IPO, I don't know, but we have to. One thing. Second is we're really strong in Turkey, but we're not around the region as much. There are 20 countries that we cover. We're probably good in 3 of them. We're okay in another 3. And then there are other 3 markets that are important, yet we're like inactive. We have to increase our presence to be as strong as we are in Turkey and other places. Well, that figure that I told you, like 15 deals in the diaspora, we can do 5. You lose 5, we don't even hear about 5. If you try to plot that to the region, Poland, for example, there are 6, 7 deals every year that are good. We're doing 2 of them. We're not that strong. Croatia, Hungary, we're pretty strong. There are 2 deals. We're pretty much covered those 2 countries, for example. But yeah, we have to deepen, because that's where we make our money, right? I mean, we make our money investing. So that's like the core of the business. And then whatever comes around it, whether that's diversifying the LP base, launching assets, etc., are just an add-on to that core, which hopefully is really lucrative. We have to grow that in different regions.
So regionally and also kind of along the life cycle of companies. So do you think it makes sense for a firm to have what would be different funds for different, like a kind of a, separate from a pre-seed seed fund, also a growth fund? And is that?
I think if they're 2 separate, yes, but you have to make them 2 separate. It's not like you can have a pre-seed fund and a Series A fund. You can have a Series A fund, and then you have this pre-IPO secondaries fund. Those are vastly different. Or a venture debt fund, just to provide working capital, again, vastly different. Or if you do an evergreen fund, that's more focused on impact companies in our portfolio, which would do either equity or debt investments into impact companies, but that has its own different LP base.
Interesting. What's the connection there between evergreen and impact?
There's I think from an LP based perspective, there's a connection, because a lot of the LPs or investors do want to do impact investments that are everlasting. And there's a lot of donation money that also gets channeled into impact VC investing as well, just because those are creating sustainable value as opposed to a one-time donation.
I mean, evergreen is an interesting concept because you don't have to deal with, you were saying how, as a seed fund, you don't want to be investing after year 5 because you need to have the time for the company to go through its evolution. As an evergreen fund, you don't have to worry about those kinds of things. On the other hand, the LP base, it's not something that they want to see 10-year funds so they can see also track record and things like that. But I guess that's interesting. Impact is a place where it does have a fit, I guess.
It does. And I think as a pre-seed fund, so on a spectrum of like pre-seed to say IPO, on pre-seed you're building information asymmetries and access asymmetries. And then even if you're looking at thousands of deals from Turkey, if you're not seeing the top 5 deals, for example, you can't make returns basically. And if a fund can build that information or access asymmetry on a pre-seed level for deals in Turkey, then that fund can ride that for decades. Those asymmetries erode stage. So if you look at pre-IPO or IPO opportunities, information asymmetry is not there. Access asymmetry is not there. It becomes more of a price war, especially post-IPO. What I think the way we want to do is anchor ourselves to pre-seed where we have that moat, but then try to democratize everything else in our business model, including evergreen fund, LP base, diversifying it, getting more LPs on board. We had 116 LPs in our fund, a large number. Do we want it to be larger? Sure, why not?
Interesting. Democratizing the asset class.
Everything else, apart from that deal making and access part, which is we feel like we're building the moat.
Well, I mean, we were talking earlier about, okay, more funds means more competition, but the idea of more money into the asset class kind of grow the pie. Certainly for the ecosystem, it's healthy to have larger funds, more funds. And especially as you were talking about like pre-IPO and And secondaries, I mean, that's, even if you don't do it as a pre-seed investor, definitely beneficial to have growth and secondary funds, which there's, since your thesis is to go global anyway, there's global funds, but in terms of the region, there's kind of a gap, right? Like after pre-seed seed, there's much less regional money that's big enough funds to
I don't think there should be. I think if the goal of the ecosystem is to build tech exporting businesses, then the financing value chain of that also doesn't have to be local. So you should try to pull in more Series A, B, C investors that are global to invest into our companies. And if there's a subset of entrepreneurs that are great but not able to get that Series A funding from global investors, I think there's a handful of them, but you can't build an actual fund around them. It's not, the numbers are really finite that are good yet not able to raise. And if you're investing into the ones that are below that, then I don't think that's going to make those good returns anyways.
You could make an argument for that a local, Series A, Series B investor might have an advantage over, at least in terms of access. Or,
I mean, I think the entrepreneur would choose that larger global firm who's going to be more multi-stage, as opposed to that local, say, couple $100 million fund doing 5 to 10 million tickets. But that's, I think, for actual primary investments. When you come to secondaries, venture debt, I don't think those financing environments are functioning enough. I don't think there are enough secondaries fund in Europe, let alone Turkey, or venture debt in Europe is only like a handful of players. So it becomes an ideal to expect a company to raise venture debt from the UK if they're good enough. It doesn't work like that. Or secondaries. So I think there, just because the whole global ecosystem is not as well functioning, there is an opportunity to raise those local funds.
So secondaries and venture debt. Very cool. That was an exciting conversation. I feel like there's enough different subjects that we could keep talking. I would love to again some other time, especially with Fund 3 coming down the pipe. Wonderful to have you. Thanks for joining.
It was great. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Turkish VC podcast. My name is Yunus Çelebilir. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and tell your friends. You can listen to more episodes wherever you find podcasts, on Spotify or YouTube, etc. If you have any suggestions for people you'd like me to interview, or if you're looking to connect with the Turkish VC ecosystem, feel free to reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn. Stay tuned for further episodes.